Hi, welcome to the next module for our Citizens Academy video series. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the city's revenue and how it works and how it relates to you as a citizen. So behind me on this whiteboard, I've delineated the different types of revenue that the city receives throughout the year. And I'm going to talk about these different types of revenue and kind of break that down into how that affects you as a taxpayer. So of course, the first category that we have in our revenue box is taxes. As much as we don't like to pay taxes, taxes provide a vital revenue source for general government services that the community is served by. What I mean by that is the fire department, for example, police department, and many other city functions serve the general population of the community. Let's talk about the fire department for a quick example. The fire department is paid for with property taxes. And the reason that it's paid for with property taxes is because it wouldn't be fair for the community to have a person whose house catches on fire pay for the fire response. Number one, that cost would be pretty exorbitant for that homeowner to pay in order to have the fire department respond to their house. Number two, because of the few number of fires that we have, it would be very difficult to support the fire department with that revenue stream. So as a result of that, the community at large has said that it is important enough to have a fire department to serve the entire community 24/7 that we would agree to pay property taxes instead of having a user fee to pay for those services. We'll kind of get into the differences here in just a moment. But property taxes, or taxes in this case, are used to pay for services that are provided to the general community as opposed to an individual user. So what types of taxes do we have? Well, as I mentioned in the example I've just talked about, we have property taxes. And the city of El Dorado brings in about $4 million of property taxes every year based on the current mill levy and the current assessed valuation of the city of El Dorado. That money, for the most part, goes into the general fund and is utilized to pay for various public services, again, like the police department, the fire department, parks and recreation, and many other services that are provided to the general community. So that's property taxes in a very brief nutshell. The important thing to note is that those dollars that you pay for based on the properties that you own go into the general fund and are used to pay general government services that apply to every property and really every taxpayer in the city. We will talk a little bit more about property taxes in a future video to include things like what's an assessed valuation, what's the mill levy, and how do I take those two to calculate my property tax bill? So be looking out for that as we get more into detail into property taxes. But for now, let's pivot and talk a little bit about the next form of taxes, sales taxes. Now, if you've been paying attention to my Things to Know video, you've probably heard me talk about sales tax. Sales tax actually is the second largest revenue source that the city of El Dorado collects. In fact, last year we brought in about $3 million worth of sales tax from a 1-cent sales tax that's assessed on all retail sales within the city of El Dorado. These dollars are important, again, for providing public services to the community, and an important consideration is that about 40% of those dollars derive from outside the city of El Dorado, meaning people that don't live in El Dorado, but that travel here to buy groceries, or they might be visiting or passing through. So it's a pretty much win-win for taxpayers because a portion of those receipts are collected from people that don't live in El Dorado. This, alternatively, helps keep our property taxes low, and especially in El Dorado, where we have about $1.65 million dedicated every year to keeping our property taxes lower than they would be without the sales tax in place. If you're counting at home, that's about 17 mils of property taxes that are currently not being paid for by property taxes because of our 1-cent sales tax. So let's talk a little bit more about sales tax. As I mentioned, sales tax is paid for from people that are buying items at the point of sale, generally retail items, and it's also charged now on online sales and even on some sales that you purchase in another community and that are delivered in El Dorado. So what are some of the benefits of having a sales tax? Well, as I mentioned, 40% comes from outside the community, but another important consideration is that by paying at the point of sale, you're not paying taxes on property that you may own. This helps distribute the tax burden equitably throughout the community, as some people do not own property in our community, which is perfectly fine, but they still benefit from services that are provided by the city, and consequently have the ability to pay by paying at the point of sale through the form of sales taxes. This way, everyone pays for local government services. And so, for example, a visitor that might be coming into town, they may not call the police department, hopefully they don't, but they do drive on our roads. And so by paying the sales tax, they're helping pay to maintain those streets in perpetuity. That's just one example of some of the benefits of our sales tax. The next set of tax that I'm going to talk about is the transient guest tax. The city brings in about $200,000 in transient guest tax that are paid on overnight hotel stays by visitors coming to El Dorado. This money is provided directly to the Experience El Dorado, and what they do with it is promote our community as well as organize various events to draw in more visitors and provide fun things for our community to do so you can experience El Dorado. You'll notice that if you go to a larger community for a conference or just for even a general overnight stay, the transient guest taxes in those communities can be a significant part of your overnight stay bill. In El Dorado, transient guest taxes are 8%. This means that on a $100 overnight stay in a hotel, you're going to spend $8 that'll go to Experience El Dorado to promote the community. This is another great tax, all things considered, because again, it's paid for by visitors. And that's a good thing because that means citizens of El Dorado don't have to pay into the Experience El Dorado department budget. Moving on, the next set of tax that we're going to talk about is the fire protection contracts. What? They're contracts. They're not taxes. Oh, but they are. Currently, the city of El Dorado has 2 contracts with fire districts that surround our community to provide fire services. The El Dorado Township and the Prospect Township both pay the city of El Dorado in a fire protection contract for these services. We call it a property tax because the amount that they pay is based on their assessed valuation, so we receive it as a property tax payment. The nice thing about that is, again, part of our fire department services are paid for by residents that do not live in the city of El Dorado. Again, this is another great benefit because it helps keep our mill levy as citizens lower than it would be had we not have those contracts coming into the city of El Dorado. Now, one of the important considerations, though, is that, in essence, the Prospect and El Dorado townships are paying for services. So the fire department does respond to fire and medical calls that are outside the city limits, but that are still within the fire department's jurisdiction per the contracts. But it's just one additional way that we provide services and help keep our budget revenues, particularly property taxes, lower than they would be otherwise. So that wraps up the tax summary. There are, of course, several other taxes that the city collects and receives that I have not highlighted, such as the liquor tax, but these amounts are small in comparison to the large amounts that we have with property taxes and sales tax. So without going through all of them, the point of this video is just to provide some clarity on some of the larger items so that you kind of understand what these primary revenue sources look like and how they function. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to pivot to the lower corner here real quick before we jump to the across the board. Fines and penalties. So the city of El Dorado brings in about $400,000 a year in court fines, and these are going to be things for violations of local ordinances and state statutes that are prosecuted through the municipal court. So if you are caught speeding in El Dorado, or maybe you drive a truck off the truck route, you're probably going to get a citation, and that citation means you're going to go to court and you're going to get fined, and those court fines are assessed. It's not really a tax because it's not mandatory. Every truck that drives through downtown or off the truck route doesn't pay a court fine. It's only the ones that get caught that have to pay that fine. Unlike taxes, which are in fact mandatory for owning property or buying retail items or doing other things that are subject to those taxes. So it's not a tax, but it's also not a user fee, which we're going to talk about now. So a user fee is a little bit different than a tax. How so? Well, as I mentioned a minute ago, a tax is mandatory. So if you own property in the city of El Dorado, by law, you are required to pay property taxes. In fact, if you go 3 years without paying your property taxes, your property is subject to a sheriff's sale and you could lose the property altogether. So taxes are mandatory, unlike user fees. User fees are not mandatory And in fact, they are paid by the user of a specific service. But that sounds kind of like it's mandatory, right? Well, it's not mandatory in the fact that if I'm not using the services, I don't have to pay for that. I don't have to pay that user fee. So let's dive a little bit more into the user fees, and maybe you can see a little bit more about what I'm talking about. So on the top of the user fee list, we have franchise fees. And the city receives about $2 million a year in franchise fees. Now, franchise fees are generally not something that you or I would pay. The city of El Dorado has several franchise agreements, which are agreements that give a specific organization, in this case a utility company, the right to use the public right of way. So to break that down, the public right of way is generally considered the area between sidewalk and the sidewalk, or in some cases from curb to curb. It just depends on your specific neighborhood and the dimensions of the public right of way. But the public right of way is in essence the area of land that the public owns and that the public has been granted access to. The perfect example of this is streets. So streets are built within the public right-of-way or a space of land that has been dedicated for public use. So you can't drive your car through your neighbor's yard because your neighbor's yard is privately owned. But the street that's located out front of the house is public right-of-way and therefore has public access. So when you leave your private driveway and get on the public street and then maneuver throughout the community and ultimately get on the state highway system and go wherever you want. Also located within the public right-of-way are public utilities. And these can include things like water lines, sewer lines. They could include stormwater conveyance pipes as well. Also included in the public right-of-way are private utility lines that have been granted access via a franchise agreement to access the public right-of-way and use it to provide certain services to our community. Examples of this include things like cable, internet services, electric, natural gas, and anything else that would be located in a conduit under the ground that's privately owned. So those companies come to the city and they enter into a franchise agreement, and the agreement provides a payment for their use of the public right-of-way. Basically what it is it's compensating the city for the use and management of the public right-of-way. There's a lot of things in the public right-of-way: streets, water lines, sewer lines, electric lines, gas lines. It's very cluttered at times, and that provides compensation to the public, you and I, for using said right-of-way. Oh, and I should say that franchise fees are a user fee because the companies that are using the public right-of-way pay the fee. The next one we're going to talk about are water and sewer fees. Water and sewer fees are not taxes because they're not mandatory. Now, you might say, what? Water is mandatory. I have to have water to wash my dishes and take a shower and do all the other things that I do with water. You'd be correct. But water is not mandatory in the sense that you can control the amount of water that you use. And the amount of water that you use is directly correlated to the amount of sewer that you use. And so water and sewer rates, or the amount that you're charged, is correlated. So to talk briefly about this, being a user fee, an individual or a household can control the amount of water and sewer that they utilize each and every month. Now, I understand that that might not be as easy as it sounds, but an example of this might be that you can decide to water your yard, or you could decide not to water your yard, and both are valid choices, but one will have a higher water cost, the other will have a lesser water cost because you're using less water. That kind of gives you a general idea of what that means. An individual who's living at home alone without any kids or other relatives living with them, they're going to have less laundry. They might have to do dishes less frequently. And so they're going to use less water than someone with a household of 5 that are living under the same roof. As I mentioned before, sewer is kind of correlated with water usage because we use your water consumption to determine your sewer rate in the wintertime. So now let's go ahead and go down. Refuse fees are kind of like water and sewer. They are user fees in that we are billing the trash customer You can say, well, but the city of El Dorado requires me to have trash. And again, you'd be correct, but you're being assessed for the services that are being delivered, meaning that refuse services are not being assessed on the property tax bill. Moving down, we also have some miscellaneous user fees, which are going to be more conducive to the user than they are to the general community. These things might be like an animal license, where if I own a dog, I license my dog, and that means the city knows that I've complied with all regulatory requirements like vaccinations and things like that. But if I lose my dog, I also might want to have that dog returned to me, and the animal license will provide a mechanism to do that. And of course, I benefit directly from that, and so an animal license helps with that. Building permits are another example of a user fee, as well as recreation fees. So if you sign your kid up for baseball, someone that doesn't have a kid signing up for baseball doesn't benefit from that, and so it should be a user fee as opposed to a property tax or general tax of the sorts. Okay, so now that we've kind of talked about the differences between taxes and user fees, I thought I'd take a very brief moment to kind of explain some of the economic advantages of having a diverse revenue structure. What that means is that we don't want to be fully funded from property taxes. Number one, that would mean that our property tax would be pretty high, as I've indicated already. And secondly, while property taxes are largely stable, they can have some fluctuations based upon the economic environment. A great example of that is with sales tax. So in an economic recession, sales taxes might actually decrease. And if you're relying on sales tax to fund local government services, that could put you in a little bit of a jam, especially if you don't have reserves to offset that difference. Because sales taxes can be volatile at times, it's important to have stabilizing revenue sources like property taxes to help make sure that the local government brings in enough revenue to ensure that local government services have enough revenue to be sustainable. But property taxes can somewhat fluctuate again with the economic conditions, but generally speaking, they are pretty stable, especially for the housing market that is in central Kansas. And then some of these other user fees and such are also good because they also help offset any economic disparities that may happen in a recession, or even if you have an unforeseen circumstance like a natural disaster or some circumstance that would affect certain revenue sources. So we kind of look at it in terms of a third, a third, a third. So about a third of our general government taxes come from property taxes, about another third comes from sales taxes, and then the final third comes from miscellaneous taxes like court fines and building permits and animal licenses. And so by doing that, we have a diverse portfolio that allows the city to continue to provide services no matter what the economic situations are. Some communities, however, are not so fortunate because they over-rely on sales taxes, for example, and when the economy crashes, so does their sales tax receipts, and that puts them in a little bit of a jam when it comes time for budget. Services have to be cut or altogether deferred, and that can be difficult for a community that relies on these kind of services. So hopefully now you understand the difference between taxes and user fees and the reasons why we rely on a diverse portfolio of revenue to help stabilize and sustain our services in El Dorado. So that's a wrap for this episode of the Citizens Academy. We're going to continue our talk on budget, including the budget process and how citizens can interact with that. We'll also talk about some transparency tools that will hopefully help you better understand the city's finances and its budget process in our next episode. We'll see you next time on Citizens Academy.